Everyone in Pine Ridge thought Marcus Hayes had finally lost his mind when he bought the broken-down cabin on Devil's Peak. The locals whispered behind his back at the general store, shaking their heads as they watched him load supplies into his old pickup truck week after week. The cabin had been abandoned for decades, its roof caved in, windows shattered, and foundation crumbling into the mountain soil. Real estate agents wouldn't even show it anymore. But Marcus saw something others didn't. After months of backbreaking work, he finally cleared enough debris to open the front door. What he found inside defied every law of nature he understood. The interior was pristine, untouched by time or weather. A fire crackled warmly in the stone hearth, and a dining table was set for 4 guests who had never arrived. What happens when the door you open leads somewhere it shouldn't? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Chapter 2. Introduction. The believer Marcus Hayes stood in the doorway for a full 10 minutes, his weathered hands gripping the frame as his mind struggled to process what lay before him. At 62, he had spent 40 years as a geology professor at the State University, teaching students about the immutable laws of physics and the predictable behavior of natural systems. He had hiked these mountains for 3 decades, understood their geological history, their weather patterns, their seasonal cycles. Nothing in his extensive education or experience had prepared him for this moment. The contrast was stark and impossible. Behind him, autumn wind howled through the gaps in what remained of the cabin's exterior walls. The roof had collapsed in at least 3 places, leaving gaping holes that should have allowed decades of rain, snow, and debris to accumulate inside. The windows had been shattered for so long that local teenagers used the frames for target practice with their slingshots. The foundation had shifted and cracked, causing the entire structure to list slightly to the northeast. Yet the interior before him belonged to a different world entirely. Warm yellow light emanated from oil lamps mounted on pristine log walls. The wooden floors gleamed with fresh polish, unmarked by water damage or rot. Heavy curtains hung perfectly pressed at windows that somehow retained their glass, clean and clear as if installed yesterday. The stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth radiating genuine heat from logs that crackled and popped with fresh flames. Marcus removed his hiking boots and stepped carefully onto the polished floor. The warmth immediately penetrated his wool socks, a welcome relief after 6 months of working in the cold mountain air. He approached the dining table, a solid oak piece that would have cost thousands of dollars new. 4 place settings awaited phantom guests. Fine china plates, crystal glasses, silver utensils arranged with formal precision. A centerpiece of fresh wildflowers filled a cut-glass vase, their petals still dewy as if picked that morning. The logical part of his mind, the part trained in scientific method and empirical observation, catalogued each impossible detail. The emotional part, long suppressed beneath decades of academic rigor, whispered that he had discovered something beyond the reach of conventional understanding. He pulled out his phone to document the scene, but the device showed no signal bars and refused to power on, despite a full charge that morning. Instead, he retrieved a leather-bound notebook from his jacket pocket and began sketching, his precise hand capturing the room's layout and contents. As he worked, he noticed a manila envelope on the mantelpiece, yellowed with age, but somehow preserved from the elements that should have destroyed it long ago. Inside the envelope, Marcus found the original property deed, dated 1923. The document bore the official seal of the county clerk, but several details made him pause. The ownership history showed gaps of exactly 30 years between recorded transfers. In 1923, the property belonged to one Harold Pemberton. The next recorded owner was listed as Margaret Chen in 1953, followed by Robert Winters in 1983. According to the deed, the current owner should have been transferred the property in 2013, but that line remained blank. as if waiting for someone to claim it. The strangest detail was the property description itself. While most deeds included precise measurements and boundary markers, this one contained a peculiar notation in faded ink. Property exists in stable temporal confluence. Ownership transfers occur naturally to suitable candidates during designated cycles. Current occupant assumes all rights and responsibilities as guardian of the threshold. Marcus read the line 3 times, his academic mind rejecting the mystical language, while his intuition recognized something profound. He had purchased the property through a standard real estate transaction just 8 months ago, dealing with lawyers and banks and county offices. Yet this original deed suggested something entirely different about the nature of ownership. The fire popped loudly, sending sparks up the chimney and drawing his attention back to the immediate impossibility surrounding him. He approached the bookshelves lining the eastern wall, running his fingers along leather spines bearing titles in multiple languages. Some volumes appeared ancient, their gold lettering worn smooth by countless hands. Others looked recently printed, their pages crisp and unmarked. One book caught his attention, a leather journal titled Observations of Temporal Phenomena at the Devil's Peak Site. He opened it carefully, finding handwritten entries in different scripts and inks, dating back over a century. The most recent entry was dated just 3 months ago, written in a feminine hand. The new caretaker approaches. Sarah must be prepared. The cycle continues as it must. Marcus set the journal aside and walked to the kitchen area, where copper pots hung from wrought iron hooks and a wood-burning stove radiated gentle heat. Fresh bread sat cooling on a wooden cutting board, its crust golden brown and still warm to the touch. A note in the same feminine handwriting lay beside it. "Welcome, Marcus. We have been expecting you. The transition will begin when you are ready. Until then, make yourself at home. E.P." His hands trembled slightly as he folded the note and placed it in his shirt pocket. Every rational explanation his mind proposed crumbled against the evidence before him. This was not an elaborate hoax or a case of mistaken identity. Something extraordinary was happening, something that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality itself. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the broken exterior walls, but inside, the cabin maintained its impossible warmth and perfect preservation. Marcus settled into a comfortable chair by the fire, opened his notebook, and began recording everything he could observe. Whatever was happening here, whatever force maintained this pocket of impossibility, he intended to understand it through careful documentation and logical analysis. After all, he was still a scientist, even in the face of the impossible. Chapter 3. Introduction continued. The mountain's reputation. The next morning, Marcus drove down the winding mountain road to Pine Ridge, with more questions than answers filling his mind. The town sat nestled in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, its main street lined with weathered storefronts that had served the community for generations. He parked outside Chen's Historical Society, a converted Victorian house that doubled as the town's unofficial repository of local memory. Sarah Chen greeted him at the door with a knowing smile that suggested she had been expecting his visit. At 45, she possessed the quiet confidence of someone deeply rooted in her community, her dark hair streaked with premature silver that caught the morning light. Her family had lived in Pine Ridge for 4 generations, and her great-grandmother's stories had shaped much of what the town remembered about its own past. "You're the professor who bought the cabin on Devil's Peak," she said, gesturing for him to enter. "I wondered when you'd come looking for answers." The interior of the Historical Society felt like a well-organized library, with filing cabinets, bookshelves, and display cases containing artifacts from the region's settlement period. Sarah led him to a reading table, where she had already assembled a collection of documents. "Photographs and newspaper clippings. Devil's Peak has quite a reputation," she began, settling into the chair across from him. "The Ute tribes who originally lived here considered it sacred ground, but not in a welcoming sense. Their oral traditions speak of it as a place where spirits from different times gather, where the boundary between past and present grows thin. She opened a folder containing photocopied pages from various sources. When the first European settlers arrived in the 1880s, they initially avoided the area. But Harold Pemberton was different. He was an architect from back east, came here specifically because of the stories. Said he wanted to build something that would work with the mountain's natural properties rather than against them. Marcus leaned forward, recognizing the name from the deed. What happened to him? That's where the story gets interesting, Sarah said, pulling out a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1923. Pemberton lived in the cabin for exactly 30 years. Then one day, he simply wasn't there anymore. No body was ever found, no signs of struggle or departure. His belongings remained undisturbed, as if he had just stepped out for a walk and never returned. She showed him additional clippings documenting similar disappearances. Margaret Chen in 1953, Robert Winters in 1983, each had lived in the cabin for precisely 30 years before vanishing without explanation. Local search parties found no traces, and the cabin would remain empty until the next person felt inexplicably drawn to purchase it. My great-grandmother knew Margaret Chen, Sarah continued. She used to say that Margaret didn't disappear, but rather stepped sideways into time. Grandmother always insisted that some people could still see Margaret walking the mountain trails, but only during certain weather conditions. Marcus pulled out his notebook and showed Sarah his sketches from the previous day. Her eyes widened as she studied his detailed drawings of the preserved interior. This matches the descriptions in my family's records, she said quietly. My great-grandmother claimed she visited the cabin once in 1952, just before Margaret's disappearance. She described exactly what you've drawn here. Sarah retrieved a manila folder marked Weather Anomalies and spread its contents across the table. The documents included meteorological reports dating back to 1925, all focusing on readings from the Devil's Peak area. The Weather Service has been tracking strange patterns around your cabin for decades, she explained. Look at these temperature readings. Marcus studied the data charts, his scientific training immediately recognizing the impossible nature of what they documented. During the harshest winter months, when temperatures throughout the region dropped well below freezing, the monitoring station near the cabin consistently recorded readings between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. These readings should be impossible, he said, running his finger along the data points. There's no geothermal activity in this area, no underground heating sources that could account for such consistent warmth. The Weather Service has replaced their equipment multiple times, thinking it was malfunctioning, Sarah said. But the readings never change. Even during blizzards that dump 4 feet of snow on the surrounding areas, the cabin site remains mysteriously warm. She showed him photographs taken by various weather monitoring teams over the years. The images revealed a consistent pattern, while the surrounding landscape would be buried under snow. A perfect circle approximately 50 yards in diameter around the cabin remained clear, the ground visible and apparently unfrozen. Local hunters and hikers have reported seeing lights in the cabin windows during storms, even when it was supposedly empty, Sarah continued. Some claim they've smelled wood smoke coming from the chimney on nights, when no one should have been there. Marcus studied a photograph from 1987 that showed the cabin's exterior in the deteriorated state he remembered from his purchase. Yet smoke was clearly visible rising from the chimney, and warm yellow light glowed in the windows. The strangest reports come from search and rescue teams, Sarah said. When they're called to look for missing hikers in the area, their instruments sometimes pick up radio signals that shouldn't exist. Voices speaking in patterns that sound like conversations, but using outdated terminology and discussing events from decades past. She pulled out a final document. This one, an official report from the county sheriff's department. 3 years ago, a hiker got lost during a sudden snowstorm. When the rescue team found him the next morning, He was sitting by a warm fire inside what he described as a perfectly restored cabin. He led them back to the exact same location, but all they found was the ruin you purchased. Marcus set down his pen and looked directly at Sarah. You don't seem surprised by any of this. You've been expecting me? Sarah's expression grew serious. My family has been keeping records of the cabin for 4 generations. We believe it serves a purpose, though we've never fully understood what that purpose might be. What I do know is that it chooses its occupants, and it chose you for a reason. The weight of her words settled over him like the mountain mist that rolled through the valleys each morning. Marcus had come seeking rational explanations, but instead found himself drawn deeper into a mystery that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of reality itself. Outside, clouds gathered around Devil's Peak, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, despite the clear morning sky. Marcus returned to the cabin that afternoon with a box of scientific instruments borrowed from his former university colleagues. Digital thermometers, electromagnetic field detectors, air pressure monitors, and a high-resolution camera filled his backpack as he climbed the familiar trail to Devil's Peak. Sarah had offered to accompany him, but he needed time alone to process everything she had shared. The exterior of the cabin remained as deteriorated as ever, its broken walls and collapsed roof sections a stark reminder of its apparent abandonment. Yet as he approached the front door, that familiar sense of crossing an invisible threshold washed over him. The air grew warmer. The harsh mountain wind softened to a gentle breeze, and the scent of burning wood drifted from the chimney. Inside, the impossible interior welcomed him once again. The fire burned steadily in the hearth. The oil lamps cast their warm glow across polished surfaces, and fresh bread waited on the kitchen counter as if baked specifically for his arrival. Marcus set down his equipment and began taking systematic readings, documenting temperature variations, electromagnetic signatures, and atmospheric pressure. Every instrument confirmed what his senses already knew. This space defied conventional physics. The temperature held steady at 72 degrees, despite the October chill outside. Electromagnetic readings fluctuated wildly, suggesting the presence of energies that his equipment couldn't properly classify. Most puzzling of all, the air pressure readings indicated an altitude nearly 3,000 feet lower than the cabin's actual elevation. While his instruments worked, Marcus explored areas of the cabin he had missed during his first visit. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms, each furnished with period-appropriate furniture that showed no signs of age or wear. In the larger bedroom, he discovered a roll-top desk containing writing supplies, blank paper, and several bound ledgers. The largest ledger caught his attention immediately. Its leather cover bore the embossed title Guest Registry in gold lettering that appeared freshly applied. Marcus opened it carefully, expecting to find blank pages or perhaps a few token entries from the cabin's early days. Instead, he found hundreds of signatures spanning what appeared to be decades of visits. The earliest entry was dated September 15th, 1923, written in Harold Pemberton's careful script. First guests arrived today. The temporal confluence is stronger than anticipated. The dining room successfully accommodated visitors from 1847, 1923, and 1954 simultaneously. Adjustments to the threshold mechanism may be necessary. Marcus turned the pages slowly, his academic mind struggling to process what he was reading. Entries appeared chronologically, but the chronology defied linear time. A signature from 1934 appeared several pages after one from 1967. Names he recognized from Sarah's historical records appeared alongside others completely unfamiliar to him. Margaret. Chen had signed on multiple occasions, her handwriting evolving subtly across entries that spanned her 30-year residence. Her final entry, dated November 30th, 1953, read, "The responsibility passes now to capable hands." Robert will understand in time, as I have learned to understand. The mountain chooses wisely. Robert Winter's entries began appearing immediately after Margaret's final signature, though they were dated December 1st, 1953. His early writing revealed confusion and fear, gradually giving way to acceptance and understanding. One entry from 1965 particularly struck Marcus. Had tea today with Harold and Margaret. Remarkable how easily conversation flows when you accept that time is merely another dimension to navigate. They're both well, merely existing in different temporal coordinates. As Marcus continued reading, patterns emerged. The registry documented regular gatherings where residents from different time periods would share meals, exchange knowledge, and maintain what they referred to as temporal stability. Each 30-year resident seemed to serve as a guide for their successor, ensuring continuity of understanding and purpose. Near the end of the filled pages, Robert Winter's handwriting appeared one final time. Dated December 15th, 1983, the new guardian approaches. I have prepared what I can. The mountain's needs grow more complex as the outside world changes rapidly. Marcus will bring the scientific understanding we have long required. Sarah must be prepared for her role. Marcus read that entry 3 times, his hands trembling slightly. Robert Winters had written his name 40 years before they had ever met, before Marcus had any connection to Pine Ridge or knowledge of the cabin's existence. Yet somehow, this man who had disappeared decades ago had known exactly who would eventually claim the property. The final entries in the registry were written in different hands, some dating as recently as last month. Signatures included names he didn't recognize, accompanied by dates that spanned impossible time frames. One entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, was written in a feminine script he was beginning to recognize. Marcus has arrived and is adjusting well to the revelations. The scientific instruments will help him document what we have long accepted through faith alone. The dining room awaits its next gathering. EP. Marcus set the registry aside and walked to the dining room, studying the 4-place settings with new understanding. This wasn't a table set for guests who never arrived. It was a table prepared for residents from different time periods who would somehow gather here, sharing meals and knowledge across the boundaries of linear time. He photographed each page of the registry, though he suspected the images would show something different than what his eyes perceived directly. Then he selected a pen from the desk and turned to the first blank page. His hand hesitated for a moment before he wrote, October 23rd, 2023, Marcus Hayes, first official entry as new resident. Scientific documentation begins today. I understand now that I have much to learn. As he set down the pen, the fire in the main room crackled more loudly, as if responding to his acceptance of whatever role awaited him. Outside, afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountain, but inside the cabin, time seemed to flow according to different rules entirely. Marcus returned to his instruments, noting that several readings had changed significantly since he had written in the registry, as if his acceptance had somehow altered the cabin's fundamental properties. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Despite Sarah's warnings about the cabin's history of temporal anomalies, he chose to spend his first full night inside. He had brought sleeping gear, additional monitoring equipment, and enough supplies for several days. Whatever was happening here, he needed to experience it directly rather than simply observe from the outside. As sunset painted the mountains in shades of amber and gold, Marcus prepared for the night ahead. He set up motion sensors in each room, positioned cameras at strategic angles, and established a baseline for all his instruments. The readings remained consistently abnormal. Electromagnetic fields that pulsed in regular patterns, temperature variations that defied the laws of thermodynamics, and air pressure readings that suggested the cabin existed at sea level rather than 8,000 feet above it. The most curious addition to his evening routine involved a grandfather clock he had discovered standing in the corner of the main room. The antique timepiece was a masterwork of craftsmanship, its mahogany case polished to a mirror shine, and its brass pendulum catching the firelight as it swung in perfect rhythm. The clock face showed Roman numerals and ornate hands that pointed to the correct time according to his wristwatch. Marcus had wound the clock that afternoon, following instructions written on a small card tucked behind the pendulum. The handwriting matched that of Harold Pemberton, and the note was brief but precise. Clock must be wound daily at sunset. Maintains temporal coordination between dimensional layers. Essential for safe navigation during nighttime hours. As darkness settled over the mountain, Marcus noticed the first sign that this night would be unlike any other. At exactly 11:30, the grandfather clock's pendulum began to slow, its steady rhythm becoming labored and uncertain. By 11:45, the pendulum had stopped entirely, the clock face frozen at that precise moment. Then, at the stroke of midnight, something extraordinary happened. The clock's hands began moving backward, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The minute hand traced its path in reverse, while the hour hand followed suit, unwinding the passage of time in defiance of every natural law Marcus understood. As the clock moved backward, the cabin itself began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. The oil lamps flickered and dimmed, their warm yellow light taking on a cooler, bluish quality. The fire in the hearth continued to burn, but its flames appeared to move in slow motion, each dancing tongue of light leaving ghostly trails in the air. Marcus checked his instruments and found them displaying readings that made no sense. His digital thermometer showed temperatures fluctuating between past and future measurements, displaying yesterday's readings, then tomorrow's, then settling on numbers that corresponded to no earthly climate. The electromagnetic field detector registered patterns that seemed to pulse in harmony with the clock's backward movement. Most disturbing of all were the sounds. As the clock continued its reverse journey through time, Marcus began hearing voices from other rooms. Conversations in hushed tones, footsteps crossing wooden floors, the clink of dishes being arranged on tables. He investigated each room methodically, finding them empty but somehow occupied, as if invisible guests were moving through spaces he could not fully perceive. At 2 a.m, according to his wristwatch, the grandfather clock showed 9 o'clock the previous evening. Marcus realized with growing unease that he was experiencing time in reverse, watching the cabin undo its evening routine while his own consciousness remained anchored to forward-moving time. The voices grew clearer as the night progressed. He could distinguish at least 4 different speakers, 2 men and 2 women, their conversations touching on topics that spanned decades. They discussed weather patterns from the 1940s, political events from the 1960s, and technological developments from the 1980s, all within the same seamless dialogue. Around 3:30 in the morning, Marcus heard his own voice joining the conversation, though he remained seated silently by the fire. This other version of himself was discussing geological surveys with someone who sounded like Harold Pemberton, sharing observations about the mountain's mineral composition and tectonic stability. The experience became increasingly disorienting as the night wore on. Marcus found himself moving between conscious observation and involuntary participation in events he couldn't remember initiating. He would be taking notes at the writing desk one moment, then find himself standing in the kitchen preparing tea for invisible guests the next. When dawn finally broke over the eastern peaks, the grandfather clock suddenly resumed its forward motion, its hands spinning rapidly to catch up with real time. The voices faded, the temperature stabilized, and the electromagnetic readings returned to their baseline abnormality. Marcus checked his wristwatch and discovered something that made his blood run cold. According to his timepiece, 3 days had passed since he had first wound the grandfather clock. Yet he had vivid memories of only one night, a single evening that had stretched and twisted through temporal corridors he couldn't begin to understand. His instruments confirmed the impossible truth. Their data logs showed 3 full days of recordings, documenting conversations, temperature changes, and electromagnetic fluctuations that corresponded to events he could not remember experiencing. Somewhere in those lost days, Marcus realized he had lived a life he could not recall, participating in gatherings that transcended the normal flow of time. Marcus stumbled down the mountain trail in a daze, his scientific instruments packed haphazardly in his backpack and his notebook filled with observations he couldn't remember making. The 3-day gap in his memory felt like a void in his consciousness, a blank space where experiences should have been but weren't accessible to his waking mind. Sarah was waiting for him at the Pine Ridge Diner, her face etched with concern that deepened when she saw his disheveled appearance. She had called the sheriff's department 2 days earlier when Marcus failed to return from what was supposed to be a single night at the cabin. "Where have you been?" she asked, as he slumped into the booth across from her. "Deputy Morrison organized a search party yesterday. They combed the entire mountainside looking for you." Marcus accepted the coffee she ordered for him, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process her words. "I was at the cabin one night. I left this morning." Sarah studied his face carefully, the way someone might examine a puzzle with missing pieces. "Marcus, it's Thursday. You went up there on Monday evening. The search team found your truck parked at the trailhead for 3 straight days." The impossibility of her statement clashed with his clear memory of experiencing only one night in the cabin. Yet the evidence mounted against his perception. His watch showed Thursday's date. His phone displayed dozens of missed calls spanning 3 days. And his beard showed 3 days of growth, despite his memory of sleeping only once. "The strangest thing," Sarah continued, "is that people reported seeing you in town during those 3 days. Mrs. Patterson swears you bought groceries at her store Tuesday morning. Tom Bradley says you stopped by his hardware shop Wednesday afternoon for lamp oil. But when we called to verify, you never answered." Marcus pulled out his notebook and showed her the pages of observations written in his own handwriting, documenting conversations and events he couldn't recall. The entries detailed meetings with Harold Pemberton, Margaret Chen, and Robert Winters, describing their appearance, their mannerisms, and their guidance regarding his role as the new guardian. "This is impossible," he muttered, reading his own words as if they belonged to a stranger. "I don't remember writing any of this." Sarah examined the entries carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each page. "These descriptions match my family's records perfectly. You've captured details about Harold Pemberton that only exist in my great-grandmother's private journals. Details I've never shared with anyone." They drove back to the cabin together that afternoon, Marcus desperate to understand what had happened during his lost days. The exterior remained as deteriorated as ever, but the moment they crossed the threshold into the preserved interior, Sarah gasped and pointed toward the hallway connecting the main room to the bedrooms. A mirror hung on the wall, where Marcus was certain no mirror had existed before. The antique-looking glass was framed in ornate silver, its surface reflecting not the hallway they stood in, but an entirely different scene. Through the mirror, they could see the same hallway, but occupied by people dressed in clothing from different historical periods. Harold Pemberton stood near the bedroom doorway, wearing a 3-piece suit from the 1920s and consulting a pocket watch. Margaret Chen passed by carrying a tea service, her 1950s dress swishing as she moved with purposeful efficiency. Robert Winters emerged from one of the bedrooms wearing casual clothing from the 1970s, his hair styled in the fashion of that era. Most unsettling of all, Marcus saw himself in the mirror, but this version wore clothes he didn't recognize and moved with the confident familiarity of someone who had lived in the cabin for years. This other Marcus was engaged in animated conversation with the historical residents, gesturing toward blueprints spread across a table that didn't exist in their current reality. "They can't see us," Sarah whispered, stepping closer to the mirror. "But we can see them." As if responding to her words, the mirror Marcus looked directly at them through the glass. His expression showed recognition and something that might have been pity. He approached the mirror from his side and pressed his palm against the surface. Marcus instinctively reached out and touched the same spot on their side of the glass. The moment their palms met, separated only by the mirror's surface, Marcus was flooded with memories from his 3 lost days. He remembered lengthy discussions about the cabin's purpose, training sessions in temporal navigation, and most importantly, warnings about the dangers he would face as the new guardian. The mirror Marcus mouthed words that became clear in his mind. The transition has begun. You cannot go back. Sarah must be prepared. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, her grip tight with fear. What's happening to you? Through the mirror, they watched as Harold Pemberton approached and placed a hand on the mirror, Marcus's shoulder. The older man's lips moved, and again, Marcus heard the words clearly in his mind. The boundary weakens. Soon all timelines will converge. You must learn quickly, or the consequences will extend far beyond this mountain. The mirror suddenly went dark, reflecting only their own frightened faces staring back from the hallway. But the message was clear. Marcus was no longer simply an observer of the cabin's mysteries. He had become an active participant in events that spanned multiple timelines, and his 3 lost days represented not lost time, but time spent learning to navigate a reality where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. Sarah's face had gone pale, and Marcus realized that whatever was happening to him would inevitably affect her as well. The cabin had chosen them both, and there was no returning to the simple life they had known before. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Historical Society before dawn, driven by an urgency she couldn't fully explain. The mirror incident had shaken something loose in her memory, fragments of her great-grandmother's stories that had seemed like folklore until now. She pulled boxes from the archive's deepest storage areas, searching for documents that might explain what Marcus was experiencing. In a cedar chest that hadn't been opened in decades, she found what she was looking for: her great-grandmother's personal collection of documents related to Devil's Peak. Among yellowed photographs and handwritten letters, she discovered a leather portfolio containing official surveyor's notes from 1923, the same year Harold Pemberton had built the cabin. The surveyor's name was Jonathan Blackwood, and his notes revealed a level of detail that went far beyond standard property documentation. Blackwood had been hired not just to map the land, but to conduct what he termed temporal stability assessments at Pemberton's specific request. Sarah spread the documents across her research table and called Marcus, who arrived within the hour, still grappling with the memories that had returned through the mirror's touch. Together, they read Blackwood's increasingly disturbed observations about the site. The initial surveys had been routine, documenting elevation, water sources, and geological features. But by the 3rd week, Blackwood's notes took on an edge of scientific bewilderment. He wrote about compass readings that changed depending on the time of day, about shadows that fell in directions contrary to the sun's position, and about temperatures that fluctuated wildly within a 50-yard radius of the proposed building site. Most intriguing was Blackwood's discovery of what he called temporal anchors scattered throughout the area. These were natural rock formations that seemed to stabilize the flow of time, creating pockets where minutes passed differently than they did just yards away. Blackwood had marked these locations on his maps with precise coordinates and detailed sketches. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a particular entry dated September 15th, 1923. He describes the exact spot where Harold chose to build the cabin as a convergence point where multiple timeline streams intersect naturally. He calls it a threshold between dimensions. Marcus studied the technical drawings that accompanied the notes. Blackwood had documented unusual magnetic readings, gravitational anomalies, and what he described as chronological distortions that intensified during certain lunar phases. The surveyor had even attempted to map these distortions, creating a 3-dimensional diagram that showed how time flowed differently at various elevations around the site. The most unsettling discovery came in Blackwood's final entries. He had encountered what he termed temporal echoes, glimpses of events that hadn't happened yet, or that had happened in different timelines. In one passage, he described seeing a cabin that existed in perfect condition, populated by residents from multiple time periods who moved through the space as if all eras existed simultaneously. "He saw what we saw in the mirror," Marcus said quietly. 70 years before we experienced it ourselves. Sarah turned to the last page of Blackwood's notes, where his handwriting had become increasingly erratic. The final entry was dated October 31st, 1923, just weeks after the cabin's completion. Pemberton was right about this place. It's not just a building site, it's a doorway between worlds. The cabin doesn't just exist in our time, it exists in all time simultaneously. I've seen enough to know that whoever lives there won't just be a resident. They'll be a guardian responsible for maintaining the balance between temporal dimensions. Attached to this final entry was a hand-drawn map showing the cabin's position relative to what Blackwood called dimensional fault lines, but invisible boundaries where different timelines intersected. The map revealed that the entire Pine Ridge Valley sat atop a complex network of these fault lines, with the cabin positioned at the most critical intersection point. According to this, Marcus said, tracing the fault lines with his finger, the cabin isn't just affected by temporal anomalies, it's actually controlling them. It's like a lighthouse that keeps different timelines from crashing into each other. Sarah found additional documents that supported this theory. Letters between Pemberton and various scientists of his era revealed that the architect had spent years researching reports of temporal phenomena before choosing the Devil's Peak site. He had corresponded with physicists, mathematicians, and even practitioners of what early 20th century science considered fringe subjects. One letter from a physicist at Princeton University, dated 1922, discussed theoretical models for dimensional intersections and the possibility of constructing artificial stabilization points. The physicist had warned Pemberton about the dangers of interfering with natural temporal barriers, but also acknowledged that such intervention might be necessary to prevent larger catastrophes. Pemberton wasn't just building a cabin, Sarah realized. He was constructing a control mechanism for something much larger, something that affects the entire region, as if responding to their growing understanding. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "The research phase is nearly complete. Dr. Warren will arrive tomorrow to begin the next stage. Prepare Sarah for her awakening. The convergence approaches." E.P. Marcus showed Sarah the message, and they both understood that their investigation had reached a turning point. They were no longer simply trying to understand the cabin's mysteries. They were being drawn into active participation in events that spanned multiple timelines and threatened to reshape their understanding of reality itself. Outside the Historical Society's windows, storm clouds gathered over Devil's Peak, and the afternoon light took on an unnatural quality that seemed to bend and shift like heat waves rising from summer pavement. That evening, Marcus returned to the cabin with a crowbar and a determination to understand every secret the building contained. Sarah's discovery of Blackwood's notes had convinced him that the cabin held layers of hidden information, and he intended to find them all. The preserved interior welcomed him as always, but this time he approached it with the methodical thoroughness of an archaeologist uncovering an ancient site. He began in the basement, a space he had only glimpsed during his previous visits. The stone foundation revealed construction techniques that seemed far more sophisticated than anything available in 1923. The mortar between stones contained flecks of metal that glowed faintly in his flashlight beam, and carved symbols decorated the walls at regular intervals. As Marcus examined the foundation more closely, he discovered small wooden tokens hidden within deliberately created recesses in the stonework. Each token was roughly the size of a silver dollar, carved from different types of wood and bearing intricate symbols that seemed to represent various cultures and time periods. The first token he found was carved from oak and bore Celtic knots intertwined with astronomical symbols. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each line carved with precision that suggested both artistic skill and ritual significance. As Marcus held it up to his flashlight, the wood seemed to warm in his palm, and he felt a strange sense of protection wash over him. More tokens emerged from their hiding places as he searched systematically through the basement. One was carved from cedar and decorated with Native American pictographs depicting mountains, spirits, and doorways between worlds. Another, made from mahogany, bore Egyptian hieroglyphs surrounding what appeared to be an ankh modified with additional symbols he didn't recognize. The most unusual token was carved from a wood he couldn't identify, its grain shifting colors in the light like oil on water. The symbols on this piece seemed to move and change as he watched, rearranging themselves into different patterns that hurt his eyes if he stared too long. Marcus counted 37 tokens in total, each one unique in its wood type, carving style, and symbolic content. Some bore dates ranging from the 1800s to the present day, while others showed no numerical markings at all. A few were inscribed with initials, HP, MC, RW, and others he didn't recognize. As he gathered the tokens and brought them upstairs to the main room, Marcus noticed that their presence seemed to affect the cabin's atmosphere. The fire burned more steadily, the oil lamps glowed brighter, and the ever-present sense of otherworldly activity felt somehow more contained and manageable. Sarah arrived just as he was arranging the tokens on the dining table, and her reaction told him that these artifacts held significance beyond their obvious craftsmanship. "My great-grandmother described objects like these," she said, picking up the Celtic token carefully. "She called them anchors, protective charms that helped residents maintain their connection to their original timeline while navigating between others." Marcus showed her the token with Native American symbols, and Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. The Ute tribes have stories about spiritual objects that could protect travelers moving between worlds. They believed certain sacred items could keep a person's soul tethered to their home reality, preventing them from becoming lost in the spaces between times. As they examined each token, patterns began to emerge. The symbols weren't random decorative elements, but rather sophisticated encoding systems that seemed to represent different approaches to temporal navigation. Some tokens appeared designed for protection, others for communication across time streams, and still others for what Marcus could only describe as reality anchoring. The token with shifting symbols proved most intriguing. When Sarah touched it, the symbols stabilized into a pattern that resembled a family tree, with her name appearing at the bottom of a genealogical chart that stretched back through multiple generations. Names she recognized from her family history appeared alongside others that seemed to exist in parallel family lines from different timelines. "This shows possibilities," she said wonderingly. "Different versions of my family tree depending on which timeline you follow. Look, here's my great-grandmother, but in this version she had a brother who became a guardian instead of her. And here's another where my grandmother never left the reservation and became a tribal keeper of temporal law." Marcus examined his own token more carefully, the one carved from the unidentifiable wood. When he focused his attention on it, the symbols arranged themselves into what appeared to be a scientific formula dealing with temporal mechanics. Variables and constants formed equations that seemed to describe the mathematical relationships governing the cabin's dimensional properties. As night fell and they continued their examination of the tokens, Marcus realized that each one represented not just a protective charm, but a accumulated knowledge from different residents across multiple timelines. The cabin's previous guardians had left these tokens as a kind of instruction manual, encoding everything they had learned about navigating temporal anomalies safely. Most importantly, the tokens seemed to respond to their handlers, adapting their symbolic content to provide information most relevant to each person's needs and abilities. They weren't just artifacts. They were interactive tools designed to guide future guardians through the complexities of dimensional stewardship. Outside, winter's first snow began to fall, but inside the cabin, the tokens glowed with gentle warmth, creating a protective circle around the dining table where past and future guardians could safely gather to share knowledge across the boundaries of time. The following morning brought Dr. Elizabeth Warren to Pine Ridge, arriving exactly as the mysterious text message had promised. Marcus had known Elizabeth for over 20 years, ever since their graduate studies at MIT, where she had specialized in quantum mechanics while he focused on geological sciences. Now in her early 60s, she brought with her a reputation as one of the country's leading theoretical physicists and a willingness to investigate phenomena that most academics dismissed as impossible. Elizabeth's arrival at the cabin was met with the same impossible preservation that had greeted Marcus weeks earlier. But unlike his gradual acceptance of the anomalies, she immediately began taking measurements with sophisticated equipment that made Marcus's borrowed instruments look primitive by comparison. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts," she said, adjusting her quantum field detector. "Whatever's happening here is generating energy signatures that shouldn't exist according to current physics models. It's as if the space itself is operating on principles we haven't discovered yet." While Elizabeth worked, Marcus continued his systematic exploration of the cabin's hidden features. In Harold Pemberton's bedroom, behind a loose floorboard beneath the writing desk, he discovered a leather-bound appointment book that felt warm to the touch, despite being stored in the cool mountain air for decades. The appointment book contained entries spanning impossible timeframes, with meetings scheduled across multiple decades and seemingly different realities. The earliest entry was dated September 1923, written in Pemberton's careful script. "Tuesday, 3 p.m. Tea with Margaret Chen to discuss temporal navigation protocols. Note, Margaret will not arrive in this timeline until 1953, but consciousness transfer allows for preliminary consultation." Marcus called Sarah and Elizabeth over to examine the book together. Page after page revealed appointments that defied conventional understanding of time and space. Margaret Chen had scheduled regular meetings with Robert Winters decades before his official arrival at the cabin. Robert had planned consultations with someone identified only as the architect, presumably Pemberton himself. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, most intriguing were the appointments involving people who had never been official residents of the cabin. Names appeared regularly that corresponded to missing persons from Pine Ridge's history, suggesting that the cabin's temporal influence extended far beyond its immediate occupants. "Look at this entry from 1967, Sarah said, pointing to a page filled with Robert Winter's handwriting. "Thursday, 7 p.m., strategy session with Dr. Warren regarding quantum stabilization techniques for dimensional anchoring. Elizabeth will provide theoretical framework in approximately 55 years. Elizabeth stopped her measurements and stared at the entry. "That's impossible. I would have been 3 years old in 1967, and I've never been to this cabin before today." Marcus turned to recent entries and found Elizabeth's name appearing frequently throughout the past 6 months, with appointments scheduled for consultations on quantum mechanics, temporal field theory, and dimensional stabilization. According to the book, she had been attending regular meetings at the cabin since spring, providing crucial scientific expertise for Marcus's transition into guardianship. The appointments aren't just records, Marcus realized. They're a schedule for events that happen across multiple timelines simultaneously. When the book says you met with Robert Winters in 1967, it means some version of you from some timeline participated in that meeting. Elizabeth examined her equipment readings more carefully. That would explain why my quantum field detector is picking up resonance patterns that match my own laboratory's signature frequencies. If different versions of myself have been working here across multiple time frames, the equipment would retain those quantum impressions. The appointment book revealed the cabin's true purpose with increasing clarity as they continued reading. The regular meetings weren't social gatherings, but rather scientific consultations, where guardians from different eras collaborated on maintaining temporal stability. Each 30-year resident brought specific expertise that was needed during their designated period. Harold Pemberton's architectural knowledge had been essential for establishing the cabin's dimensional anchoring systems. Margaret Chen's intuitive understanding of temporal navigation had guided the development of safety protocols. Robert Winter's engineering background had enabled crucial upgrades to the cabin's stabilization mechanisms during a period of increasing temporal instability. According to the appointment book, Marcus's scientific training was needed for the current era because traditional guardian methods were becoming insufficient. The rapid technological advancement of the 21st century was creating new types of temporal disturbances that required both modern scientific understanding and ancient guardian wisdom to manage. The pattern is accelerating, Sarah observed, studying the frequency of appointments. Early entries show meetings every few weeks or months, but recent appointments are scheduled daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Something is building toward a critical point. Elizabeth's equipment suddenly registered a massive spike in quantum field activity. All three of them looked up to see figures moving through the main room, translucent but clearly visible. Harold Pemberton stood at the fireplace consulting his pocket watch, while Margaret Chen arranged papers on the dining table. Robert Winters emerged from the kitchen carrying a tea service, and moving among them was a figure that looked exactly like Marcus, but wearing clothes from a different era, and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had been guardian for years. The appointment book in Marcus's hands began to write itself, invisible hands filling in new entries. Today, 2 p.m., integration meeting with all guardians. Final preparations for convergence event. Dr. Warren to provide quantum anchor calculations. Sarah Chen to accept guardian apprenticeship. Timeline, stabilization protocols to be implemented before winter solstice. As they watched the spectral meeting unfold before them, Marcus understood that they were no longer observers of the cabin's mysteries. They had become active participants in a process that had been planned across multiple decades and timelines, and their roles in the coming convergence had been predetermined, long before any of them had ever heard of Devil's Peak. Dr. Warren's quantum field detector became the key to understanding what Marcus had been experiencing during his lost days at the cabin. The sophisticated instrument, originally designed for laboratory research into parallel universe theory, registered energy patterns that defied every known principle of physics. These readings indicate the presence of multiple overlapping reality fields, Elizabeth explained, adjusting the detector's sensitivity settings. It's as if several different versions of this space exist simultaneously, each operating according to slightly different physical laws. Marcus watched the device's display screen show wave-like patterns that pulsed in rhythm with the grandfather clock's pendulum. During normal daylight hours, the readings showed relatively stable temporal fields with minor fluctuations. But as evening approached, the detector registered increasingly dramatic spikes in quantum activity. The temporal distortions intensify after sunset, Elizabeth observed. Whatever force maintains this place's impossible preservation draws more energy during nighttime hours. I think that's when the barriers between different timeline streams become most permeable. Sarah suggested they conduct a controlled experiment to document exactly what happened during Marcus's overnight stays, despite his apprehension about experiencing another memory gap. Marcus agreed to spend another night in the cabin while Elizabeth monitored everything through her equipment from outside. They established a communication protocol using walkie-talkies that would allow Elizabeth to maintain contact with Marcus even if he entered one of the temporal displacement states. The quantum field detector was positioned to record energy fluctuations throughout the night, while additional sensors measured temperature, electromagnetic activity, and atmospheric pressure. As darkness fell, the familiar transformation began. The grandfather clock's pendulum slowed, then stopped, then began its backward journey through time. Elizabeth's equipment immediately registered massive spikes in quantum field activity, readings that suggested reality itself was being restructured around the cabin. Through the walkie-talkie, Marcus described what he was experiencing. The oil lamps are changing color. The fire is moving in slow motion. I can hear voices from the other rooms again, but they're clearer now. Elizabeth, your detector is right. There are multiple versions of this space overlapping. Elizabeth's readings confirmed his observations. The quantum field detector showed at least 4 distinct reality signatures operating simultaneously within the cabin's boundaries. Each signature corresponded to a different time period, and Marcus was somehow able to navigate between them consciously rather than losing awareness as he had during his first night. I can see Harold Pemberton working at his drafting table, Marcus reported. He's making modifications to the cabin's blueprint based on calculations I provided him yesterday. Elizabeth yesterday was 70 years ago in his timeline, but it was also yesterday in my memory. The detector registered a sudden spike as Marcus apparently shifted between reality layers. Elizabeth heard his voice change subtly over the radio, taking on different speech patterns and knowledge bases as he conversed with residents from different eras. Margaret Chen is teaching me how to navigate the timeline stream safely, Marcus said, his voice now carrying a confidence that hadn't been there moments before. She says the quantum field detector is providing the first scientific measurement of what they've understood intuitively for decades. The cabin doesn't just exist in multiple timelines. It actively coordinates them. Throughout the night, Elizabeth documented conversations between Marcus and the historical residents, recording discussions about temporal mechanics that seemed to blend ancient wisdom with cutting-edge theoretical physics. The quantum field detector revealed that these weren't hallucinations or psychological phenomena, but actual interactions with consciousness, streams from different time periods. Most remarkably, the detector showed that Marcus's own quantum signature was becoming more complex as the night progressed. Rather than losing his identity while navigating between timelines, he was developing the ability to maintain multiple temporal connections simultaneously. The equipment is showing something extraordinary, Elizabeth radioed to Marcus. Your consciousness is learning to exist in multiple timeline streams at once without losing coherence. You're becoming a kind of temporal bridge between different eras. By dawn, Marcus had gained conscious control over his timeline navigation abilities. He could deliberately shift his awareness between different time periods while retaining memory of each experience. The quantum field detector confirmed that he was no longer simply a visitor to the cabin's temporal anomalies. He had become an integral part of the system that maintained stability between different reality streams. The detector readings show that Marcus has developed quantum entanglement with the cabin's temporal matrix. Elizabeth explained to Sarah as they reviewed the night's data. He's not just living in this place. He's become a living component of its dimensional stabilization system. The implications were staggering. Marcus had evolved beyond normal human consciousness, developing abilities that allowed him to serve as a guardian, not just of a single timeline, but of the entire network of intersecting realities that converged at Devil's Peak. Elizabeth's equipment also revealed disturbing trends in the quantum field readings. The energy required to maintain temporal stability was increasing exponentially, suggesting that some kind of crisis was approaching that would test the limits of the cabin's dimensional anchoring systems. According to these measurements, Elizabeth said grimly. The convergence event mentioned in the appointment book isn't just a significant occurrence. It's an impending catastrophe that could destabilize timelines across the entire region. Marcus's transformation into a conscious guardian may be the only thing that can prevent temporal chaos from spreading beyond these mountains. The quantum field detector had revealed the true scope of their responsibility and the enormous stakes involved in mastering the cabin's mysteries before the approaching convergence overwhelmed their ability to maintain control. The morning after Marcus's successful navigation experiment, Sarah arrived at the cabin carrying a worn leather journal she had discovered in her family's attic. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it on the dining table, and Marcus could see the weight of revelation in her eyes. "I found this in my great-grandmother's trunk," she said quietly. "I've been reading it all night, and I understand now why my family has always felt connected to this place. Marcus, my great-grandmother didn't just know about the cabin's properties. She was supposed to be a guardian herself. The diary belonged to Elena Pacheco, Sarah's great-grandmother, and its pages revealed a story that recontextualized everything Sarah had believed about her family history. Elena had been chosen as a guardian in 1952 during the final year of Harold Pemberton's residency. The diary documented her training in temporal navigation, her developing abilities to sense dimensional fluctuations, and her growing understanding of the enormous responsibility that came with guardianship. Elizabeth listened intently as Sarah read passages aloud, her scientific mind fascinated by Elena's detailed descriptions of temporal phenomena that matched her quantum field measurements perfectly. May 15th, 1952, Sarah read. "Harold has taught me to see the timeline streams that flow around the cabin like rivers of light. Each stream carries the memories and experiences of different eras, and a guardian must learn to navigate between them without becoming lost in the currents. The responsibility is overwhelming, but the alternative is chaos." The diary revealed that Elena had spent months preparing for her transition into full guardianship, working closely with Harold Pemberton to understand the cabin's complex systems. She had demonstrated exceptional natural ability, developing temporal navigation skills that surpassed even experienced guardians from previous generations. But in November 1952, Elena had made a choice that altered the entire guardian succession plan. She had fallen in love with a young man from Pine Ridge named Joseph Chen, and the prospect of eternal guardianship meant abandoning any possibility of a normal human life. November 30th, 1952, Sarah continued reading. "I cannot accept the mantle. My heart belongs to Joseph, and my future lies in building a life that spans only one timeline. Harold understands, though he warns that my bloodline will carry the calling forward. My children or their children will face the choice I cannot make." Elena had passed the guardianship to Margaret Chen, her cousin, who had accepted the role and served faithfully for 30 years. But Elena's diary revealed that the guardian calling didn't simply disappear when someone refused it. Instead, it passed through bloodlines, waiting for the right combination of circumstances and character to manifest again. "She knew," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elena knew that someone in our family would eventually return to fulfill the obligation she couldn't accept, and she spent the rest of her life preparing for that possibility." The diary's later entries documented Elena's efforts to preserve knowledge and maintain connection to the cabin's guardians. Across multiple decades, she had served as an unofficial liaison between the Pine Ridge community and the successive guardians, helping to protect the cabin's secrets while ensuring that future generations of her family would be ready when the calling returned. Most remarkably, Elena had developed the ability to perceive timeline fluctuations even after refusing guardianship. The diary contained detailed observations about temporal disturbances affecting the entire Pine Ridge Valley. and her growing concern that the current Guardian system was becoming insufficient to handle increasing dimensional instability. The disturbances grow stronger with each passing year. Sarah read from a 1975 entry. Robert Winters is skilled, but he's only one Guardian trying to maintain stability across multiple expanding timeline networks. The convergence my grandmother's stories warned about is approaching, and when it arrives, multiple Guardians will be needed to prevent catastrophic timeline collapse. Elizabeth's equipment suddenly registered a massive quantum field spike as Sarah read those words. The cabin itself seemed to respond to Elena's prophetic warning, and through the windows, they could see the ghostly figures of past Guardians materializing in the main room. Elena Pacheco appeared among them, her form translucent but unmistakably real. She approached Sarah with a smile that carried decades of love and regret, placing spectral hands on her great-granddaughter's shoulders. "The choice I couldn't make. You were born to embrace." Elena's voice whispered through the cabin's temporal streams. "Your heart is strong enough to love both the mortal world and the eternal responsibility. Marcus will need you beside him when the convergence begins." Sarah felt the inheritance of her family's Guardian legacy settling around her like a familiar cloak. The sensitivity to temporal fluctuations she had always attributed to intuition revealed itself as inherited Guardian abilities that had been dormant until this moment. "I can feel them," Sarah said wonderfully, looking around the room at the assembled Guardians from different eras. "All the timeline streams flowing around us. It's like seeing colors that don't have names, or hearing music that exists between the notes." Elena's diary had revealed the truth. Sarah wasn't just Marcus's research partner or emotional support. She was his destined co-guardian, inheriting abilities and responsibilities that had been passed down through generations of her family, waiting for the moment when they would be needed to face the approaching convergence crisis. The Guardian Circle was finally complete, just as the timeline disturbances were reaching critical levels that would test their combined abilities to their absolute limits. 3 days after Sarah's awakening to her Guardian heritage, Marcus made a discovery that changed their understanding of the cabin's true antiquity. While exploring the Foundation's deepest levels with Elizabeth's ground-penetrating radar, they detected hollow spaces beneath the basement floor that predated Harold Pemberton's construction by centuries. Working carefully with archaeological tools borrowed from the university, they uncovered a chamber carved directly into the mountain's bedrock. The space was small, but precisely engineered, its walls covered with symbols that bore no resemblance to any historical culture Marcus recognized. Most significantly, the chamber contained 3 stone tablets arranged on a natural shelf of rock. The tablets were carved from a dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their surfaces bore inscriptions in multiple languages and symbol systems. Some sections appeared to be in ancient pictographs that resembled Native American petroglyphs, while others showed symbols that looked Egyptian, Celtic, and Asian in origin. Most disturbing were areas where the symbols seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, as if the stone itself was alive. Elizabeth's equipment registered unusual quantum signatures from the tablets, readings that suggested they were somehow interfacing with the same temporal fields that maintained the cabin's impossible preservation. When Sarah touched the first tablet, the symbols rearranged themselves into modern English, allowing them to read warnings that had been left by civilizations spanning thousands of years. The first tablet spoke of a doorway that devours time, describing a natural phenomenon that occurred at specific locations where dimensional barriers grew thin. According to the inscription, these sites would periodically release temporal energies that could destabilize reality across vast areas unless properly contained and channeled. The hungry spirits of lost time gather at the threshold. Sarah read from the tablet's surface. They seek to reclaim the years stolen by those who have walked between worlds. When the convergence arrives, the boundary will fail unless guardians stand ready to offer their own temporal essence as sacrifice. The second tablet contained more specific warnings about the consequences of guardian failure. It described civilizations that had been erased from time when dimensional anchors collapsed, leaving behind only shadows and echoes in the historical record. Cities vanishing overnight, entire cultures disappearing as if they had never existed. People simply ceasing to be as timeline paradoxes, consumed their existence. Most chilling was the tablet's description of the time hunger that would eventually consume guardians who stayed too long at dimensional threshold sites. The inscription warned that prolonged exposure to temporal fields would gradually dissolve a person's connection to their original timeline, causing them to fade from reality as they became increasingly dispersed across multiple time streams. This explains the 30-year cycles, Marcus realized, with growing horror. The previous guardians didn't choose to disappear. They were consumed by the temporal energies they were trying to control. Their consciousness became so distributed across different timelines that they could no longer maintain coherent existence in any single reality. The third tablet provided the most urgent warning of all. It described a cyclical event called the Great Convergence that occurred approximately every 300 years, when accumulated temporal disturbances would reach critical mass and threaten to cascade across multiple dimensional barriers simultaneously. According to the inscription, the next great convergence was approaching, and the signs were already manifesting: increased temporal storms, reality fluctuations affecting larger geographical areas, and the spontaneous appearance of dimensional rifts that could not be contained by traditional guardian methods. The old ways will not suffice when the great turning comes. Sarah read from the tablet's constantly shifting text. Multiple guardians must unite their essence, combining ancient wisdom with new understanding. Only through willing sacrifice can the tide of chaos be turned back upon itself. Elizabeth's reading showed that the tablets themselves were somehow connected to a vast network of similar warning systems scattered across the globe. Her quantum field detector registered faint signals from other dimensional anchor points, suggesting that guardians at multiple sites worldwide were preparing for the same convergence event. "These aren't just local warnings," Elizabeth said, studying her equipment displays. "The tablets are part of a planetary early warning system. Guardian sites around the world are all experiencing increased temporal instability simultaneously. As if responding to their growing understanding, the cabin's supernatural activity intensified dramatically. The ghostly figures of past guardians appeared with increasing frequency and clarity, no longer confined to specific times of day or particular rooms. Harold Pemberton, Margaret Chen, and Robert Winters moved through the space constantly now, working together to prepare for something that required all their combined expertise. Most unsettling was the appearance of guardians from other sites, spectral figures who materialized briefly to share warnings and coordinate preparations with the Devil's Peak Guardians. An elderly woman speaking what sounded like ancient Gaelic warned about time, storms gathering in the northern reaches. A man in robes, bearing Asian symbols, reported, the dimensional tears spreading like infection across the southern continent. The stone tablets had revealed that Marcus and Sarah weren't just inheriting responsibility for a single dimensional anchor point. They were joining a global network of guardians, preparing to face a crisis that threatened the stability of time itself across the entire planet. The convergence was no longer a distant possibility, but an approaching reality that would test every guardian site simultaneously. And according to the tablet's warnings, many of those sites would fail, leaving only the strongest and most prepared guardians to prevent a complete collapse of temporal reality. As winter deepened around Devil's Peak, Marcus and Sarah realized they had very little time left to master abilities that previous guardians had spent decades developing. The stone tablets had made one thing clear. The approaching convergence would either transform them into something beyond human consciousness, or destroy them entirely in the process of saving the world. The truth about the cabin's construction came to light when Sarah discovered a hidden compartment behind Harold Pemberton's writing desk. Inside lay a rolled set of blueprints, unlike anything Marcus had seen in his decades of studying structural engineering. The plans showed the cabin not as a simple dwelling, but as an intricate machine designed to manipulate the fundamental forces of time and space. The architect's blueprint revealed layers of complexity hidden beneath the cabin's rustic appearance. What appeared to be simple log walls contained precisely calculated geometric patterns that channeled temporal energies through specific pathways. The stone foundation wasn't just structural support, but rather a massive focusing array that concentrated dimensional forces into manageable streams. Most remarkably, the blueprint showed that the cabin had been designed as what Pemberton called a dimensional anchor, a fixed point that prevented chaotic timeline fluctuations from spreading beyond the immediate area. The entire structure functioned as a massive stabilization device, using the natural temporal anomalies of Devil's Peak to create a controlled environment where multiple timelines could safely intersect. "This is extraordinary," Elizabeth said, studying the technical drawings with her physicist's eye. Pemberton somehow understood principles of quantum mechanics and dimensional theory that we're only beginning to discover today. He built a machine that operates on scientific principles that weren't supposed to exist in 1923. Marcus examined notations written in Pemberton's careful script along the margins of the blueprint. The architect had documented calculations dealing with temporal field dynamics, quantum entanglement across multiple dimensions, and mathematical formulas for predicting convergence events centuries in advance. But the most shocking revelation came in Pemberton's personal notes attached to the blueprint's final page. The cabin hadn't been built to contain the temporal anomalies at Devil's Peak. It had been constructed to deliberately amplify them, creating a beacon that would attract individuals with latent guardian abilities from across multiple timelines. "The selection process was never random," Marcus read aloud from Pemberton's notes. "The cabin calls to those whose quantum signatures are compatible with dimensional navigation." Marcus Hayes was identified as a potential guardian in 1995, when temporal scans revealed his unique neurological patterns. The property purchase, the restoration work, even his first night experience, all were orchestrated to prepare him for conscious acceptance of guardian responsibilities. Sarah found her own name mentioned in Pemberton's notes, along with detailed analysis of her family's hereditary sensitivity to temporal fluctuations. According to the blueprint's documentation, Elena Pacheco's refusal of guardianship had been anticipated and planned for, with the knowledge that her bloodline would eventually produce someone with even stronger abilities. "We weren't chosen randomly," Sarah said, the implications settling over her like a cold mountain wind. "We were specifically bred for this purpose across multiple generations. Our entire lives have been preparation for the convergence." Elizabeth's equipment registered massive spikes in quantum activity as they absorbed this revelation. The cabin itself seemed to respond to their growing understanding, and the ghostly figure of Harold Pemberton materialized with unusual clarity and substance. "The deception was necessary," Pemberton's voice carried clearly through the temporal streams. "If you had known the true scope of your destiny from the beginning, fear would have prevented you from developing the abilities you now possess. The gradual revelation allowed your consciousness to expand naturally into guardian awareness." Marcus felt a mixture of anger and awe as he realized how thoroughly his life had been manipulated. Every major decision he had made, from his choice of academic specialization to his retirement location, had been influenced by subtle temporal signals designed to guide him toward this moment. The convergence requires guardians who can think both scientifically and intuitively, Pemberton continued. Previous generations of guardians relied primarily on inherited wisdom and natural sensitivity. But the approaching crisis demands guardians who can understand the dimensional mechanics intellectually, while maintaining emotional connection to their human origins. The blueprint revealed one final, disturbing truth. The Great Convergence wasn't a natural cyclical event, but rather the inevitable result of accumulated temporal debris from decades of guardian interventions. Each time guardians prevented local timeline collapses, they created disturbances that propagated through the dimensional matrix, building toward a crisis that would either stabilize the entire system permanently or destroy it completely. We're not just preventing catastrophe, Marcus realized. We're actually causing it. Every intervention creates ripple effects that contribute to the convergence. The system is designed to reach a breaking point where fundamental change becomes inevitable. Pemberton's spectral form nodded gravely. The old Guardian system was always temporary. The convergence will either destroy the dimensional barriers entirely, allowing chaos to consume multiple realities, or it will transform the barriers into something stable and permanent. Your generation of Guardians was specifically chosen and trained to guide that transformation rather than simply resist it. The architect's blueprint had revealed the ultimate truth. Marcus and Sarah weren't just inheriting responsibility for maintaining the status quo. They were being prepared to fundamentally reshape the relationship between time, space, and human consciousness on a planetary scale. The weight of that responsibility settled over them as winter winds howled around the cabin, and the convergence drew ever closer. The morning after discovering Pemberton's blueprint, Marcus found himself standing before a choice that would define not only his own fate, but the future of temporal stability across multiple dimensions. The decision crystallized around a single artifact that Harold Pemberton had left in a place of honor on the cabin's mantelpiece. An ornate brass key unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. The key was approximately 6 inches long, its surface covered with intricate engravings that seemed to move and shift in the firelight. The head of the key bore symbols from multiple cultures and time periods, while its teeth were cut in patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than human vision could properly process. Sarah picked up the key carefully. In the moment her fingers made contact with its surface, the cabin's temporal fields responded dramatically. Elizabeth's equipment registered quantum spikes that threatened to overload her senses, while the ghostly figures of past guardians materialized with unprecedented clarity and urgency. The Guardian's key, Margaret Chen's voice carried clearly through the dimensional streams. It unlocks conscious control over the cabin's temporal functions. But once activated, there is no return to normal human existence. The bearer becomes permanently anchored to the dimensional matrix. Robert Winters appeared beside Margaret, his expression grave. I held that key for 30 years, Marcus. It grants incredible power to navigate and control timeline streams, but it also binds you irrevocably to this place. Your consciousness becomes distributed across multiple timelines simultaneously. You gain the ability to exist in many realities at once, but you lose the ability to exist fully in any single one. Marcus understood now why previous guardians had seemed to fade away after 30 years. They hadn't been consumed by temporal energies. They had been transformed into something beyond normal human existence. Their consciousness expanded across multiple dimensions until they could no longer maintain coherent presence in linear time. Harold Pemberton materialized with unusual solidity, his architect's eye studying Marcus with professional assessment. The convergence changes everything, he said. Previous guardians could maintain limited existence in their original timeline while serving as dimensional anchors. But the approaching crisis requires guardians who can operate fully within the temporal matrix itself. The D key represented more than just enhanced abilities. It was a doorway to a form of consciousness that transcended normal human limitations. But it was also a form of death, the end of linear existence as Marcus had always known it. Elizabeth's measurements show that the dimensional barriers are deteriorating faster than we anticipated, Sarah said, reading data from the quantum field detector. We have perhaps weeks before local timeline instabilities begin cascading across the region. Someone has to accept the key's transformation soon, or the convergence will overwhelm our ability to maintain any control. Marcus examined the key more closely, feeling its weight both physical and metaphysical. Through the metal surface, he could sense the vast network of guardian sites around the globe, each one struggling to contain increasing temporal disturbances. Many were already failing, their guardians either overwhelmed by forces they couldn't understand or consumed by energies they couldn't control. "If I take the key," Marcus said slowly, "what happens to my relationship with Sarah? What happens to any possibility of a normal life?" Margaret Chen's expression softened with understanding. "Love transcends timeline boundaries, Marcus. Sarah carries guardian heritage that allows her to maintain connection across multiple dimensional streams. You wouldn't lose each other. You would gain the ability to exist together across all possible realities simultaneously." Elizabeth's scientific mind struggled with the implications. "You're talking about uploading human consciousness into a quantum matrix that spans multiple universes. The Marcus who accepts that key won't be the same person we know now. None of us are the same people we were when we first arrived at this cabin," Sarah pointed out. "We've already been transformed by our experiences here. The key just makes that transformation conscious and complete." As if sensing the weight of their deliberation, hostile voices began echoing from the valley below. Through the cabin's windows, they could see lights moving up the mountain trail, townspeople from Pine Ridge carrying torches and firearms, their fears about the cabin finally overcoming their reluctance to confront its mysteries directly. "The locals have organized," Robert Winters observed grimly. "They've decided the cabin represents a threat that must be eliminated. They're coming to destroy what they don't understand, and their interference could trigger the very convergence catastrophe we're trying to prevent." Marcus took the Guardian's key from Sarah's hands, feeling its impossible weight and the destiny it represented. The choice was no longer abstract. Accept transformation and gain the power to protect both the cabin and the surrounding communities, or remain human and watch helplessly as fear and ignorance triggered a temporal disaster that could consume multiple realities. The sound of approaching voices grew louder, and Marcus realized that his time for careful consideration had run out. The hostile voices from the valley grew closer as Marcus clutched the Guardian's key, its metal surface warming against his palm. But before he could make his final decision, Elizabeth's equipment registered readings that changed everything. Temporal disturbances were accelerating far beyond their predicted timeline. In Harold Pemberton's study, a previously hidden panel slid open in the wall, revealing a three-dimensional crystalline structure suspended in a frame of carved obsidian. The artifact pulsed with internal light that corresponded to Elizabeth's quantum field readings, creating a living map of temporal streams flowing through and around Devil's Peak. The temporal map, Harold Pemberton's spectral form, appeared beside them. "I hoped it wouldn't be needed for another decade, but the convergence is advancing faster than any of our calculations predicted." The crystal structure showed the Pine Ridge Valley as a complex web of intersecting timeline streams, each one glowing with different colors that indicated various temporal states. Stable streams appeared as steady blue lines, while unstable areas pulsed with agitated reds and oranges. Most alarmingly, large sections of the map showed streams fragmenting into chaotic patterns that suggested imminent timeline collapse. Sarah studied the map with her newly awakened guardian senses, perceiving layers of temporal information that her normal vision couldn't have processed. "The disturbances aren't just centered on the cabin anymore," she said. "They're spreading outward in concentric waves. Pine Ridge, the neighboring valleys, even the distant mountain ranges are showing signs of temporal instability." Elizabeth's instruments confirmed what the map revealed. Quantum field fluctuations were cascading across a much larger area than they had anticipated, creating a domino effect that threatened to destabilize timelines across hundreds of square miles. The convergence wasn't approaching gradually. It was erupting like a volcano that had been building pressure for decades. "The townspeople's interference is accelerating the process," Margaret Chen warned, materializing beside the temporal map. "Their fear and hostility are generating negative emotional energy that feeds the dimensional instabilities. Every step they take up the mountain increases the chaos field around the cabin. Through the cabin's windows, they could see at least 20 people climbing the trail, led by Deputy Sheriff Morrison and several long-time Pine Ridge residents who had grown increasingly agitated about the strange activities on Devil's Peak. They carried not just weapons, but also gasoline and torches, intending to burn down what they perceived as the source of their community's troubles. The temporal map showed how their approach was affecting the dimensional matrix. Red warning indicators appeared along the mountainside, marking spots where timeline streams were beginning to fracture under the pressure of concentrated fear and anger. If the mob reached the cabin and attempted to destroy it, the resulting explosion of temporal energy could tear holes in reality itself. "We're out of time," Robert Winters observed grimly. "The convergence is happening now whether we're ready or not. Marcus must make his choice immediately, or the decision will be made for all of us by forces beyond our control." Marcus studied the temporal map, watching as streams of light converged on the cabin's location like rivers flowing toward a waterfall. The mathematical precision of the pattern reminded him of his geological training, but instead of understanding rock formations and mineral deposits, he was learning to read the flow of time itself across dimensional boundaries. "There's something else," he said, pointing to areas of the map where multiple timeline streams seemed to be merging rather than fracturing. "These convergence points aren't just sources of instability. They're places where different realities are becoming permanently linked. The crisis isn't just destructive, it's transformative." Elizabeth's reading supported his observation. At specific locations throughout the valley, quantum signatures were stabilizing into new patterns that suggested the formation of permanent dimensional bridges. The convergence wasn't just threatening to destroy existing timelines, it was creating new forms of temporal reality that could exist stably across multiple dimensions. "That's why you were chosen," Harold Pemberton said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of planning. "Previous Guardians were selected for their ability to maintain existing systems. But this convergence requires Guardians who can guide the transformation into something new and stable." The temporal map revealed the true scope of their task. They weren't just trying to prevent a catastrophe. They were midwifing the birth of a new form of reality where multiple timelines could coexist without mutual destruction. The process required conscious guidance from Guardians who could understand both the scientific principles involved and the human consequences of such fundamental change. As the mob's torches grew brighter in the darkness outside, Marcus realized that his choice with the Guardian's key would determine not just his own fate, but the nature of reality itself for countless people across multiple dimensions. The convergence was unstoppable now, but its outcome could still be shaped by Guardians willing to sacrifice their individual humanity for the preservation of consciousness itself across time and space. The temporal map pulsed with increasing urgency, its crystalline structure resonating with dimensional forces that were building toward a crescendo that would either create something beautiful and stable or destroy everything they had worked to protect. Marcus raised the Guardian's key toward the lock that had materialized on the cabin's front door, knowing that turning it would begin a transformation that could never be undone. But understanding, finally, that some choices transcend personal considerations when the stakes involve the survival of reality itself. As the mob's torches illuminated the mountainside below, Sarah made a discovery that would prove crucial to their survival. While Marcus struggled with his decision about the Guardian's key, she had been examining the cabin's foundation with new eyes, her awakened Guardian senses revealing details that normal perception couldn't detect. Carved into the stone foundation itself, hidden beneath decades of accumulated earth and debris, lay an intricate circle of symbols that formed a protective barrier around the entire cabin structure. The ancient markings had been etched by hands from multiple time periods, each generation of Guardians adding their own protective elements to create a layered defense system against hostile forces. The protection circle, Elena Pacheco's spirit whispered to Sarah through the temporal streams. I helped carve some of those symbols myself, working alongside Margaret Chen in 1952. Each mark channels the cabin's temporal energies outward, creating a barrier that can repel physical and psychic attacks. Sarah ran her fingers along the carved symbols, feeling them warm to her touch as the circle responded to her Guardian heritage. The markings included Celtic knots that Harold Pemberton had inscribed, Native American ward symbols that predated the cabin's construction, and geometric patterns that seemed to shift and evolve. As she watched, how do we activate it? Marcus asked, still holding the Guardian's key but reluctant to commit to transformation until they had exhausted all other options. Margaret Chen's spectral form knelt beside Sarah, guiding her hands to specific symbols within the circle. The protection requires a Guardian's conscious intent and a sacrifice of temporal energy. You must give part of your life force to power the barrier, but in return, it will shield the cabin from any force that seeks to destroy rather than understand. The mob had reached the halfway point up the mountain trail, their angry voices carrying clearly through the night air. Deputy Morrison's voice could be heard above the others, trying to maintain some semblance of legal authority while addressing a situation that no law enforcement training had prepared him for. That place isn't natural, shouted Tom Bradley, the hardware store owner who had sold Marcus supplies for months. People have been disappearing on that mountain for decades. We should have burned it down years ago. Elizabeth's quantum field detector registered massive spikes in dimensional activity as the mob's collective fear and anger created what she could only describe as a psychic storm that was destabilizing the already fragile temporal matrix around the cabin. Their emotions are acting like a catalyst, Elizabeth reported. The convergence is accelerating exponentially. We have minutes, not hours, before the dimensional barriers collapse completely. Sarah pressed her palms against the foundation stones, feeling the protection circle's potential thrumming beneath her touch. The symbols began to glow with soft blue light that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, drawing energy from her Guardian heritage and channeling it into a barrier that extended upward and outward from the cabin's foundation. The moment the protection circle activated, the approaching mob encountered its effects. Their torches suddenly flickered and dimmed despite the absence of wind. Several people stumbled as if walking through invisible resistance, while others stopped entirely, overcome by an inexplicable sense that they were trespassing on sacred ground. What's happening? Deputy Morrison called out, his flashlight beam scattering strangely as it encountered the barrier's edge. The air feels thick, like we're walking through water, but the protection circle's activation came at a cost. Sarah felt years of her life being drawn into the barrier's energy matrix, her temporal essence being consumed to power the ancient defensive system. Her hair began showing streaks of premature gray, and fine lines appeared around her eyes as the circle aged her physically in exchange for supernatural protection. "It's working," Marcus said. Watching through the windows as the mob's advance slowed and several people began retreating back down the mountain. "But it's consuming Sarah's life force. We can't maintain this indefinitely." Robert Winters materialized beside them, his expression grim. The protection circle was always meant as a temporary measure, a way to buy time during crisis situations. It cannot hold against sustained assault, and it certainly cannot contain the convergence energies that are building toward critical mass. The temporal map's crystalline structure pulsed more urgently, showing timeline streams beginning to fracture and merge in chaotic patterns that threatened to create permanent dimensional tiers. The convergence was no longer approaching, it was beginning, and their window for controlled guidance was rapidly closing. Through the barrier, they could see some members of the mob regrouping and discussing different approaches. Fear and determination warred in their voices as they realized that conventional methods weren't going to be sufficient to destroy what they perceived as a supernatural threat to their community. "They're going to try again," Elizabeth observed, monitoring both her equipment and the mob's behavior. "And each attempt will generate more psychic turbulence that accelerates the convergence process. The protection circle might keep them out, but it can't prevent the dimensional catastrophe that their interference is helping to trigger." Sarah looked up at Marcus, her face already showing the aging effects of powering the protection circle. "I can hold the barrier for maybe another hour," she said. "But then you'll have to make your choice about the Guardian's key, or the convergence will overwhelm us all." The protection circle had bought them precious time, but it had also revealed the true cost of Guardian responsibility, the willingness to sacrifice personal welfare for the preservation of something larger than individual survival, with Sarah's life force visibly draining to maintain the protection circle in the temporal map, showing reality fracturing around them. Marcus finally understood that hesitation was no longer an option. The Guardian's key felt warm and alive in his hands as he approached the lock that had materialized on the cabin's front door, knowing that turning it would begin an irreversible transformation. The moment the key engaged the lock, the cabin's entire structure responded with a deep harmonic resonance that seemed to emerge from the mountain itself. Every artifact they had discovered began to glow and pulse in unison. The grandfather clock, the mirror, the guest registry, the tokens, all harmonizing with energies that had been building for decades. Marcus felt the transformation begin immediately. His consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of his individual mind, connecting simultaneously to past guardians, future possibilities, and alternate timeline streams where different versions of himself had made different choices. The sensation was overwhelming and beautiful, terrifying and enlightening, as his awareness stretched across dimensions that his human brain had never been designed to perceive. As the transformation deepened, a final artifact revealed itself within the cabin's temporal matrix. A circlet of woven light materialized above Marcus's head, settling gently onto his brow like a crown made from crystallized time itself. The Guardian's crown allowed him to perceive all timeline streams simultaneously, without losing his sense of individual identity, anchoring his consciousness across multiple realities while maintaining coherent thought and purpose. Through the crown's enhanced perception, Marcus could see the mob outside the protection circle with perfect clarity. Their fear and anger appeared as visible energy fields that were indeed feeding the convergence chaos. But he could also see their underlying humanity. Parents worried about their children's safety, elderly residents frightened by changes they couldn't understand, decent people pushed to extremes by circumstances beyond their comprehension. "I can see them all," Marcus said, his voice carrying new harmonics that resonated across multiple timeline streams. Every person in Pine Ridge, their fears, their hopes, their connections to this place across multiple generations. They're not enemies, they're part of the pattern that needs to be healed. Sarah felt the change in the cabin's energy field as Marcus's transformation reached completion. The protection circles drain. On her life force diminished as the Guardian's crown began channeling power from the temporal matrix itself, rather than from individual Guardian essence. Through the crown's perception, Marcus could see the true scope of the convergence crisis. Timeline fractures were appearing across the globe as other Guardian sites failed to contain the mounting dimensional pressures. In Tibet, ancient monks were losing their battle against temporal storms that threatened to erase entire mountain ranges from existence. In Peru, Guardian sites were going dark one by one as their protectors were overwhelmed by forces they couldn't control. But Marcus could also see the solution. The convergence wasn't random chaos. It was a natural evolutionary process that occurred when dimensional systems became too complex to maintain through traditional methods. The crisis could be resolved not by resisting the convergence, but by consciously guiding it towards stable integration. Elizabeth, Marcus said, his transformed consciousness interfacing directly with her quantum field detector. The readings you're seeing aren't system failures, they're birth pangs. Reality is evolving into something more complex and stable, but it needs conscious guidance through the transition. Working through the Guardian's crown, Marcus began to actively shape the convergence process. Instead of trying to prevent timeline streams from intersecting, he guided their integration in ways that created stable quantum bridges between different realities. Where chaos threatened to consume entire regions, he channeled the energies into constructive patterns that strengthened rather than destroyed the dimensional matrix. The mob outside suddenly stopped their advance entirely, not because of the protection circle's barrier, but because they could sense the fundamental change occurring in the cabin's energy field. Fear began transforming into wonder as they witnessed lights in the sky that seemed to dance between dimensions, showing glimpses of the profound transformation taking place. Sarah felt her own consciousness expanding as the crown's influence included her through their emotional connection. Her Guardian heritage responded to Marcus's transformation, allowing her to serve as his anchor to humanity while he navigated the vast complexities of multidimensional reality. "I can see our future," Sarah said wonderfully. "Not just one possible future, but all of them simultaneously. We don't lose our humanity by becoming guardians. We become more human by accepting responsibility for protecting all possible expressions of human consciousness across every timeline." The convergence reached its crescendo as Marcus channeled its energies through the Guardian's crown, transforming potential catastrophe into controlled evolution. Timeline streams that had been chaotic and destructive suddenly aligned in stable patterns that allowed multiple realities to coexist peacefully within the same dimensional space. Across the globe, other Guardian sites began stabilizing as the wave of controlled convergence energy reached them, providing the support and guidance their struggling protectors needed to maintain their own dimensional anchors. The Guardian's crown had revealed the truth. The convergence was never meant to be prevented, but rather to be transformed from destruction into creation, from chaos into a new form of ordered reality where consciousness could exist safely across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Marcus had become something beyond human, but in doing so, he had preserved humanity's future across every possible timeline where it might exist. 3 months after the convergence, life in Pine Ridge had settled into a new rhythm that acknowledged the extraordinary while embracing the familiar. The cabin on Devil's Peak stood as it always had, appearing to casual observers as a weathered ruin, slowly surrendering to the mountain's harsh winters. But those who knew its secrets understood that it now served as something far more significant than a single dimensional anchor point. Marcus and Sarah had evolved into their roles as co-guardians in ways that surprised even the previous generation of protectors. Rather than becoming isolated from the human community, they had found ways to bridge the gap between ordinary life and extraordinary responsibility. The Guardian's crown had taught Marcus to exist simultaneously across multiple timeline streams while maintaining his connection to linear reality, allowing him to serve both as temporal guardian and as a member of the Pine Ridge community. The transformation had affected Sarah as well, though in subtly different ways. Her consciousness had expanded to encompass not just temporal awareness, but also deep intuitive understanding of how individual choices rippled across multiple timeline streams. She had become a counselor and guide for people throughout the valley who found themselves experiencing dreams, visions, or unexplained memories that were actually glimpses of their alternate selves in parallel realities. Dr. Warren had established a permanent research station at the cabin, documenting the successful stabilization of dimensional barriers and studying the new forms of quantum coherence that had emerged from the guided convergence. Her equipment now registered steady, stable readings that indicated a healthy dimensional matrix operating exactly as the ancient designers had intended. On this particular afternoon, Marcus found himself updating the guest registry that had been his first real clue about the cabin's true nature. The leather-bound book had evolved since the convergence, its pages now containing entries from guardians at stabilized sites around the globe, creating a real-time communication network between dimensional anchor points worldwide. The updated guest registry served as both historical record and active coordination tool. Entries appeared automatically as guardians at other sites documented their experiences, shared discoveries, and requested consultation on complex dimensional management issues. Marcus had become something of a specialist in convergence guidance, helping other guardian sites navigate smaller-scale dimensional transitions that had previously been beyond their capabilities. Today marks 90 days since the Great Convergence. Marcus wrote in his careful script, "The dimensional matrix remains stable across all monitored regions. Local timeline streams have integrated successfully, allowing residents of Pine Ridge to occasionally glimpse alternate versions of their lives without experiencing disorientation or distress." Sarah continues to counsel individuals through the adjustment process, helping them understand these experiences as gifts rather than disturbances. As he wrote, entries from other guardians appeared on facing pages. A guardian in Scotland reported successful integration of Celtic timeline streams that had been fragmented for centuries. Protectors in Japan documented the stabilization of temporal anomalies that had affected earthquake prediction patterns. Most encouragingly, several new guardian sites had activated spontaneously as individuals with latent abilities felt called to establish dimensional anchor points in previously unstable regions. Sarah entered the cabin carrying fresh bread from Pine Ridge's bakery and tea from the hardware store that Tom Bradley had started stocking specifically for their visits to town. The relationship between the Guardians and the local community had evolved from fear and suspicion to cautious acceptance, and eventually to genuine appreciation for the protection and stability their presence provided. "Mrs. Patterson asked me to thank you for helping her understand her dreams about her grandmother," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside Marcus at the writing desk. "She's been seeing memories from timeline streams where her grandmother survived the influenza pandemic and lived to meet her great-grandchildren. Instead of being frightened, she's finding comfort in knowing that version of her family exists somewhere." Marcus smiled, remembering his own initial terror at discovering the cabin's impossible interior. Now that same impossibility felt like home, a natural expression of reality's true complexity, rather than a violation of natural law. He turned to a fresh page in the guest registry and began documenting their plans for the future. New guardians were emerging regularly, drawn to dimensional anchor points by the same subtle temporal signals that had originally guided him to Devil's Peak. Rather than the traditional 30-year cycles of individual guardianship, the post-convergent system supported networks of guardians who could share responsibilities and provide mutual support. Elizabeth will be training the first group of scientific guardians next month. Marcus wrote, individuals whose academic backgrounds complement their intuitive abilities, creating a new generation of protectors who can work with both ancient wisdom and modern understanding. The isolation that characterized previous Guardian experiences is no longer necessary. As evening approached, Marcus added a final entry to the registry. The guest table is set for 4, as it has been for a century. But now we understand that it represents not absent visitors, but the eternal gathering of consciousness across time and space. Past, present, future, and possibility, all meeting in the eternal, now that exists, whenever beings choose to serve something greater than themselves. Outside, snow began falling gently over Devil's Peak, and inside the cabin, the fire burned warmly as it always had, welcoming any traveler brave enough to discover that home exists wherever consciousness chooses to take responsibility for protecting the infinite possibilities of existence itself.